One bull, one virgin, one deal that should have ended in silence until it awakened a love that defied a nation. Before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The sun burned low on the horizon, flattening the desert into a golden sea of heat and silence. Dust rose in slow spirals from the hooves of cattle penned at the edge of the village. Beyond them, the lone bull stood tethered, a massive beast with shoulders like boulders, its breath steaming in the cool of late afternoon. Men gathered in clusters, their voices hushed, their eyes sharp with judgment. Women lingered at doorways, pretending not to watch but listening to every word carried on the dry wind. Something unusual was about to happen, something that would live in whispers long after the dust settled. The deal had been struck days before. A bull for a girl. To outsiders, it might have sounded crude, even barbaric, but on this land, every exchange carried weight. Livestock meant survival meat, hide trade status. A girl, untouched, meant honor, alliances, the chance of children. The arrangement was not about romance. It was about power, about what family could gain and another could give away. And yet, at the center of this bargain stood a man who had asked for nothing. The warrior was Apache, known only by his silence and the scars that ran across his arms like maps of old battles. He had once ridden with his people, fought in wars no one cared to remember, and lost more than most men could carry. Now he lived on the outskirts, in a crude shelter of hides and cedar, away from the noise of the village. He spoke to no one unless pressed. Children were warned not to follow him. Some said he was cursed. Others whispered that he carried the spirits of those he had killed. Whatever the truth, he had become a figure carved from loneliness. So when the elders announced that a virgin would be given to him, the news struck like lightning. The villagers asked the same question in a dozen different ways. Why him? Why her? Why now? The girl, 19 years old, stood trembling in the doorway of her father's house as the sun bled orange across the desert sky. She was draped in simple cloth, her hair braided, her face pale with fear and defiance. She had grown up believing that her life was hers to shape, that perhaps she might choose a husband, or at least bargain for one she did not despise. But no one had asked her this time. Her father had made the decision, his voice calm and final as stone. The bull will feed us. The Apache will take you. That is the way of things. Her mother's eyes had shone with tears, but she said nothing. Women rarely did in matters such as these. Now as the village gathered, the girl's heart beat like a drum. She wanted to run, to scream, to claw her way free from the eyes that branded her like cattle. But something in the way the Apache stood tall, unflinching, his face unreadable, held her still. He looked neither pleased nor angry. He simply existed, as though the storm around him had nothing to do with him at all. The bull snorted, pawing the ground. A boy tugged at its rope, leading it toward the waiting elder who would oversee the trade. The elder's voice rang out, deep and deliberate, each word heavy with ritual. A bull for a bride. Flesh for flesh. Strength for life. The warrior gave no reply, no gesture of thanks or acknowledgement. He merely stepped forward, his shadow long across the dirt. His eyes met the girl's for the briefest moment. In that sliver of time, she saw no hunger, no cruelty, only a depth of silence so vast it frightened her more than anger ever could. The deal was sealed. The bull was tethered to the girl's father's pen. The girl was placed in the warrior's care. Just like that, her life had been rewritten. The village dispersed, murmuring. Some said the Apache would break her spirit before the first frost. Others claimed she would not last a week in his barren world. But one truth lingered in every corner. This was not a union of love. It was a transaction. And yet, as the girl followed the warrior out of the village, the setting sun casting their figures into silhouettes against the desert. Something unspoken passed between them, an invisible thread, fragile but undeniable. Neither of them knew it yet, but the trade that began with the bull was about to awaken. Something far more dangerous than survival. Something no one had bargained for. The warrior's name had long been forgotten in the mouths of the villagers. Some claimed he had another name once, given at birth beneath the stars, but whatever it was, it had been buried under war, loss, and silence. Now they simply called him the Apache, as though he were not a man at all, but a reminder of a people most wished to forget. He lived a mile beyond the village, where the mesquite trees grew twisted and the soil was too thin for crops. His shelter was nothing more than hides stretched over cedar poles, sturdy against wind but offering no comfort. A single fire pit smoldered in front, surrounded by stones blackened from years of flame. There were no decorations, no tokens of family, no soft touches of a woman's hand. Only weapons, tools, and the smell of smoke. Each dawn he rose before the light reached the mountains. He hunted alone, his bow strung tight, his knife honed sharp. He moved like a shadow through the desert, taking only what he needed, never more, never less. He cooked his meals over the fire, ate in silence, and drank water carried from the spring that bubbled weakly half a mile away. At night, he sat with his back against a stone, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though waiting for something that never came. The children of the village told stories about him. They said he could kill a deer at 200 paces with a single arrow. They said he spoke to spirits, that the wind carried his words, that he could vanish into the desert like smoke. Some swore they had seen him talking to no one, his lips moving against the stars. Others insisted he carried the ghosts of men he had slain, and that was why he never smiled. The elders, however, remembered the truth. He had once been a warrior of renown, a fighter whose name carried weight in battle. But war is a fire that consumes even those who survive it. The raids, the betrayals, the treaties broken by pale-skinned men, all of it had chipped away at him. He had buried brothers. He had buried his wife. He had buried his child. After that, he had laid down not his weapons but his place among his people. He walked away from the council fire and never returned to the villagers. He was a ghost of the old ways. To himself, he was nothing but a man stripped of everything worth living for. When the virgin was traded to him, he did not ask for her. He did not even want her. To him, the deal was a weight forced onto shoulders already heavy with grief. A bull for a bride, it was an arrangement that belonged to others, not him. He had no desire for family, no hunger for companionship. He had carved out a life in silence and meant to keep it that way. Yet when he stood in the circle of villagers and saw her small, pale, trembling like a deer cornered by wolves, something stirred. Not warmth, not desire, but a recognition of fear he had once carried himself. She was not a gift. She was not a prize. She was a sacrifice, and he knew what it meant to be sacrificed by others' decisions. As they walked together into the wilderness, her steps unsure, he did not speak. He offered no hand to guide her, no words to calm her trembling. He moved ahead, steady and silent, expecting her to follow or collapse. In his world, weakness was swallowed whole. But every few moments, when the crunch of her steps faltered, his ears sharpened, his shoulders tightened. He listened, waiting. And though he never turned, he slowed his pace. Just enough for her to keep up. When they reached his dwelling, she stopped short. The place looked more like a camp for a traveler than a home for two. The hides, the fire pit, the barren ground, it was clear he had never intended to share it with anyone. For the first time that day, her fear was joined by something else, anger. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice sharp, trembling less now, more alive. He glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, then turned back to the fire pit. He crouched, struck flint to stone, and coaxed sparks into flame. "This is where I live," he said, his voice low. Rough as gravel. It was the first time she had heard him speak. That night, as the fire cracked between them, they did not look at one another. He sat cross-legged, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring into the flames. The silence stretched long, heavy, filled with everything unspoken. Two strangers, bound by a trade neither had chosen. A warrior who wanted nothing. A girl who wanted freedom. Yet in that silence, beneath the desert stars, the first threads of a story neither of them could control had already begun to weave. The desert had a way of stripping things down to their bones. By the time the girl reached the Apache's shelter, she already felt as though something had been peeled away from her comfort, familiarity, even the illusion that she still belonged to her family. With every step into the wilderness, the village became smaller in her memory, until it seemed like a place she might never see again. When she finally stood before his dwelling, she couldn't hide her disappointment. She had imagined. Well, she didn't know what she had imagined. Perhaps a lodge, a space with woven mats, a place that at least looked like it had been prepared for a woman. Instead, she found little more than stretched hides and blackened stones. No warmth, no welcome. Just survival. He ignored her hesitation. Without a word, he set down the bundle of meat he had carried from the hunt, stripped the hide from it with practiced efficiency, and began slicing it into strips to dry. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. It was as if she weren't even there. She stood at the edge of the camp, hands twisting in her skirt, anger burning beneath her fear. Her life had been reduced to this, traded for a bull, handed to a man who couldn't be bothered to look at her. "Is this all?" she asked finally, her voice sharper than she intended. His knife paused on the flesh. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to her. His eyes were unreadable, the color of obsidian, steady and unblinking. She felt them press against her chest like a weight. "This is what there is," he said simply. Then he returned to his work. The words cut deeper than she expected. She wanted to scream at him, to demand more, to demand anything, but something in his tone made her hesitate. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mocking. He was just empty, as if the question itself was useless. That night, she tried to make herself small beside the fire. He had given her a blanket, nothing more. No explanation of where she should sleep, no attempt to reassure her. He ate his share of the meat, handed her a portion, then returned to the silence. She nibbled at the food, forcing it down despite the knot in her stomach. When the fire sank low, she lay down on the earth and pulled the blanket tight. The ground was hard, the air sharp with desert chill. She thought of her bed in her father's house, of her mother's quiet presence, of the soft murmur of her sisters as they whispered into the night. The ache in her chest grew unbearable. She pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle a sob. Across the fire, the Apache sat with his back against the stone, eyes open, knife in hand. She thought he wasn't paying attention. But when her breath hitched in the dark, his head turned slightly, his gaze finding her through the glow of the coals. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Yet for a moment, she felt seen. The days that followed were harder than she imagined. He rose with the dawn, and she was expected to keep up. He taught her nothing, explained nothing, but she watched and learned. How to gather water from the spring. How to lay strips of meat over the fire to dry. How to patch the hides that flapped against the wind. Her hands blistered, her feet ached, her body protested, but she endured. She would not let him see her break. Sometimes she caught him watching her, though he always looked away before she could hold his gaze. It wasn't the look of a man weighing a woman like property. It was quieter, heavier, like he was measuring her against something unseen. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the fire burned bright between them, She finally asked, "Why did you take me? You don't even want me here." He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without lifting his eyes from the flames, he said, "I did not take you. They gave you." The words should have made her angrier, but instead they loosened something inside her chest. For the first time, she realized he was as trapped in this arrangement as she was. She studied him in the firelight, the hard lines of his face, the scars on his arms, the silence that wrapped around him like a second skin. He was not a monster, nor a savior. He was just a man who had been given something he never asked for, and though she still feared him, though she still hated the trade that had stolen her life, a new thought flickered in her mind, fragile and dangerous as a spark in dry grass. If he did not want this any more than I did, then maybe we were not enemies after all. The days stretched into weeks. The desert did not soften, nor did the Apache. Yet something between them began to change. As slow and steady as water-carving stone dot at first, it was in the smallest moments. She noticed the way he always walked ahead of her, but never so far that she couldn't keep up. The way he left water at her side of the fire each morning, though he never spoke of it. The way his eyes flicked toward her whenever she stumbled, sharp and watchful, even if his body never moved to catch her. One evening, after a long day of gathering mesquite wood, she dropped the bundle too heavily, her hands red with splinters. She hissed in pain, biting back tears. He came to her without a word, took her hands in his, and picked out the shards with his knife tip, steady and precise. His touch was careful, not rough, though his face betrayed nothing. When he finished, he bound her palm in a strip of hide and returned to his work. She sat there staring at her hands, the warmth of his touch still lingering, and for the first time since she'd left her village, she felt something other than fear or anger. She felt confusion, and beneath it, something she dared not name. Nights by the fire grew heavier with silence, but not the cold silence of strangers. This was different, charged, alive. The flames cast shadows across his face, making his scars look like rivers carved into stone. She found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the stillness in his shoulders, the way he seemed carved from the same desert they both endured. Once, she caught him looking back. Their eyes held for only a heartbeat before he turned away, but the echo of it lingered all night. The girl began to dream of things she could not tell herself in daylight. Not of escape, not of her family, but of the way his hand had brushed hers when passing her a piece of meat, of the quiet strength in his voice the rare times he spoke. She hated herself for it, hated that her body betrayed her mind. But the more she tried to bury it, the more it grew that it wasn't just her. He, too, seemed unsettled. His silences stretched longer, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was something he would not. He began to linger by the fire after she lay down, sharpening his knife slowly, eyes distant. His glances at her grew less fleeting, less careful, as though he could no longer resist them. One evening, a storm rolled across the desert. Lightning flashed, splitting the sky, thunder echoing like drums of war. Rain came hard, lashing against the hides of their shelter. She woke in the night to find water seeping through the ground beneath her blanket. He was already awake, crouched by the fire pit, his eyes glowing in the flicker of lightning. When he saw her shivering, he pulled his own blanket from his shoulders and laid it over her without a word. For a moment, their faces were inches apart, lit by the flash of stormlight. She could see the lines of weariness around his eyes, the scars of loss, the loneliness carved deep into him. And in that moment, something shifted. He was not just the warrior, not just the man who had received her in a trade. He was human. Broken, perhaps beyond repair, but human. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything. But words felt too fragile, too dangerous. Instead, she held his gaze until the thunder rolled again. And then he pulled away, retreating to his side of the fire. Neither of them slept. The storm raged outside, but the real storm was between them, silent and dangerous. The next morning nothing was said. They rose, gathered wood, tended the fire. But every glance, every brush of hands, every shared silence was different now. The air was thicker, heavier, as though it carried the weight of something forbidden. They both knew it. Neither admitted it. But the spark had been lit, and in a land where tradition was iron and love was a luxury no one could afford, a spark could burn everything to the ground. Word traveled faster than wind across the plains. It always did. The village had traded away a virgin for a bull, and by now everyone expected the story to fade into silence. But silence never lasts where human pride and envy lived. At first, it was whispers carried on the breath of women who fetched water from the stream, traded among men who gathered around fires at dusk. The Apache had been seen walking with the girl to the spring. She no longer looked broken, they said. She walked beside him, not behind. She carried herself differently, as though she belonged not to the family who had traded her, nor to the elders who had arranged it, but to him. Too bold, one woman muttered. Too soon, another replied. The men were sharper with their words. She was meant to serve, not to soften him, one scoffed. Others warned, a woman given to a man like him must know her place, or she will bring shame on us all. The girl felt the stares when she returned to the village for water. Where once people had looked at her with pity, now they looked with suspicion. Their gazes lingered too long, probing, judging. She heard the hiss of their words even when they pretended not to speak. She's too close to him, too willing, too changed. Her father avoided her eyes. Her mother tried to press food into her hands but never spoke. Her sisters giggled behind her back, though she saw the envy in their faces. A bull was a great prize, but what was a bull compared to the quiet strength of the man she lived with? It wasn't long before the whispers reached the elders. They sat in their circle, cloaked in the authority of tradition, and weighed what they had heard. To them, the Apache was not a man but a tool, a vessel for old debts and an outlet for the village's fears. They had given him the girl not as a gift but as a burden to tether him, to quiet him, to keep him on the fringes where he belonged. But now, the story had twisted. Instead of being silenced, he seemed steadier. Instead of being broken, the girl seemed alive. Dangerous, one elder said flatly. If she loves him, she gives him power. The others nodded. Power was not something they could afford him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert bled red into shadows, a group of men came to the Apache's shelter. They were not elders, but younger men suitors who had once looked upon the girl with hungry eyes, men who believed she should have been theirs. They came with false smiles and bitter words hidden in their throats. She belongs to the village, not to you, one said, his tone light but edged like a blade. She was given for duty, another added. Not for affection. The Apache listened in silence, seated by his fire. His eyes moved over them, calm and steady, while the girl hovered just inside the shelter, her heart pounding. She could see the tension in the men's shoulders, the way their hands lingered near the knives at their belts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravel rough. She was given. She is mine. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the group. The men shifted, anger flaring in their eyes. One spat into the dirt. Another sneered. But none dared press closer. There was something in his gaze, something wild, something unbroken, that reminded them he was not like them. He was forged in battle, tempered in silence, and not a man to be tested lightly. They left, but their anger did not. The girl knew it. She saw it in the way they looked back at her. Their eyes filled not just with jealousy, but with a promise. This was not over. That night, as she sat by the fire, her hands trembling, she whispered, "They'll come again." The Apache glanced at her, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "Let them." The defiance in his voice both comforted and terrified her. For the first time, she realized that their bond was no longer invisible. It was no longer hidden in silence and glances. The village had seen it. The elders had judged it. The men had challenged it, and she knew, deep in her bones, that the price of this forbidden love was only beginning to be demanded. The desert night had teeth. It bit at the girl's skin as she lay beneath the hides, the fire outside burning low. Sleep would not come. She heard every sound, the wind rattling mesquite branches, the distant cry of a coyote, the scrape of the Apache's knife as he sharpened it in the dark. His silence was her shield, but tonight even that felt fragile. She knew it was coming. She had seen it in the villagers' eyes, in the way their whispers turned into stares, in the way her father refused to meet her gaze. The men who had come before had not been satisfied. The elders would not remain quiet. Something was building, heavy as thunder before a storm. The storm broke at dawn. The first shout carried across the desert like a blade. "Apache!" Then came the sound of boots in the dirt, many feet, heavy and sure. The girl scrambled to the doorway, heart hammering. A group of men approached, half a dozen, maybe more. Some carried spears, others knives, one a rifle slung across his shoulder. Their faces were hard, set with a resolve that left no room for doubt. This was not a warning. This was a reckoning. The Apache rose slowly from his place by the fire. He did not reach for his bow or his knife at first. He simply stood, his shadow long in the rising sun, his silence heavier than the weapons they carried. The man with the rifle stepped forward. He was young, broad-shouldered, his jaw set with the arrogance of someone who had never lost more than pride. "You dishonor her," he spat. "She was given to you for duty, not for." His eyes flicked to the girl, his voice dripping with contempt. "Not for love." The word hung in the air like a spark. The girl felt it strike her chest, sharp and undeniable. Love, spoken aloud. It felt like both an accusation and a truth she could no longer deny. The Apache's gaze flicked from the speaker to the others, steady and unflinching. "Go back," he said simply, but they had not come to be dismissed. Another man lunged forward, his knife flashing. The Apache moved with the swiftness of a predator, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting, sending the blade clattering into the dirt. In the same motion, he shoved him back into the others, his face still calm, his breathing even. The girl's heart thundered. Violence was moments away from swallowing them all. "Enough!" shouted another voice. An elder appeared at the edge of the crowd, his presence heavy with the weight of tradition. His gaze fell on the Apache, then on the girl, and what he saw confirmed the whispers. She was no longer frightened, no longer cowering. She stood beside him, shoulders squared, her chin lifted as if she belonged there. "This is shame," the elder said, his voice deep with finality. "The trade was made for duty, not desire. This," he pointed between them, "is forbiddance." The girl opened her mouth before she could stop herself. "I am not forbiddance. I am his." The crowd erupted, gasps and shouts crashing like waves. She felt the heat of their judgment, their fury, their fear. But she did not step back. She could not. The words were out, and they were true. The Apache did not move, did not speak, but in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes softened when they flicked toward her, she knew he had heard what she said. He had accepted it. The elder's face hardened. "Then you choose exile. Both of you." The weight of the words sank like a stone in the girl's chest. Exile. To be cast out of the village, denied family, denied community, left to the wilderness. It was death, slow and certain. But before she could answer, before her fear could take root, the Apache spoke. His voice was calm, but every word struck like steel. "Then exile it is." The crowd fell silent. The men shifted uneasily, gripping their weapons but not daring to use them. The elder's jaw clenched, but he gave no order to strike. Tradition had spoken. The lovers had chosen. The girl felt her knees weaken, but the Apache's hand brushed against hers, barely a touch, but enough to steady her. It was the first time he had reached for her, the first time he had claimed her not with silence but with action. The judgment had been passed. The breaking point reached. They would no longer live in shadows, no longer pretend their bond was nothing. Love had been named, seen, condemned. And now it had torn them from everything they had known. As the crowd dispersed, their exile sealed. The girl looked at the man beside her and knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would rather walk into the wilderness with him than stay in the village without him. And for the first time, he looked back at her with something close to the same truth. The morning after their judgment, the desert felt different. The air was heavy, not with heat, but with the weight of what lay ahead. The village had cast them out. They were no longer bound by duty, no longer tethered to tradition. But freedom in this land was not a gift. Freedom was a gamble, and the stakes were their lives. The girl stood by the spring, filling the water skin, her reflection rippling on the surface. She barely recognized herself. Only weeks ago, she had been a daughter, a sister, a possession to be traded. Now, she was something else, something more. She was a woman standing on the edge of a choice that would define her forever. Behind her, the Apache packed quietly. He did not rush, did not speak, but every motion was purposeful. He gathered strips of dried meat, tied them into bundles. He rolled hides for shelter, checked the edge of his knife, strung his bow. His movements carried the same calm as always, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. Exile was not new to him. He had been living apart from people long before the elders gave it a name. But this was different. This time, he would not be alone. When she returned with the water, he looked at her, his gaze steady. "If you come, there is no return." His words struck deep, not as a warning but as truth. She knew it already. Exile was not a season, it was forever. If she walked away with him now, she would never again step into her mother's house, never again hear her sisters laugh, never again carry water from the village well. Her throat tightened. She thought of her family, of her mother's silent sorrow, her father's hard silence, the sisters who envied her and pitied her in the same breath. Would they miss her? Would they curse her name? Or would they simply go on, tending their cattle, grateful for the bull they had gained in her trade? She turned back to the man who waited for her answer. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes held something new, a question, maybe even hope, though he would never speak it aloud. "I will not go back," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Something flickered in his expression then, so brief she almost missed it. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the easing of a weight he had carried too long. He nodded once, then slung the bundles across his shoulders. They walked away from the shelter as the sun rose, casting their shadows long across the desert floor. With each step, the village grew smaller behind them until it was nothing but a smear of smoke against the horizon. Ahead lay nothing but open land, harsh, unforgiving, endless. For hours they did not speak. The desert swallowed their words, demanding silence. But in the rhythm of their steps, in the way he adjusted his pace to match hers, in the way his hand brushed hers when passing her the water skin, she felt the truth of their choice. They had not chosen survival. They had chosen each other. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast canyon, its walls burning red in the dying light. The girl stopped, her breath catching. It was beautiful, yes, but also terrifying. The wilderness was not a home. It was a test. What now? She asked, her voice small against the roar of the wind. The Apache studied the horizon, his eyes narrowed. Now we live. She wanted to ask more how, where, for how long, but the words died on her tongue. He had given her the only answer that mattered. That night, they built a fire beneath the open sky. The stars burned like cold fire above them, brighter than she had ever seen. She wrapped herself in a hide, shivering not from cold but from the enormity of what they had done. He sat across from her, his face lit by the flames, his scars softened by the glow. For a long time neither spoke. Then, quietly, she whispered, "I would rather die with you than live without you." His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time she saw the wall of silence around him crack. Not with words, he gave none, but with the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something close, something real. In that moment, she knew their choice was not exile, not survival, not rebellion. It was love. And love, forbidden or not, was worth every risk the desert would demand. The desert was vast, but word was faster. Within days, the village's judgment had spread across the plains. Strangers watched the Apache and the girl from a distance, riders passing on the horizon, hunters pausing in their tracks. Exile did not mean invisibility. It meant being marked. And once marked, danger followed. One evening, as the sun bled its last light across the canyon, they heard it, hoofbeats. Not the rhythm of a single rider, but many. The girl froze where she stood, her heart clawing up into her throat. The Apache's hand closed around her arm, not rough, not gentle, but steady. He pulled her close to the rock face and motioned for silence. The riders appeared moments later, a band of villagers led by the young man with the rifle. His jaw was clenched, his pride bruised, his rage sharpened into something more dangerous than jealousy, purpose. There. One of them shouted, pointing toward the canyon rim. The Apache stepped forward, placing himself between the girl and the men. He carried no rifle, only his bow and knife. Against their weapons, it seemed madness. But his stance was unshaken, as though he had stood like this 100 times before alone, outnumbered, unwilling to yield. The young man with the rifle sneered. "You were warned. You chose exile. Yet here you are, stealing what belongs to us." His eyes flicked to the girl, hard and cruel. "She is ours." "Not yours." Something broke inside her then, not fear, not shame, but fury. She stepped from behind the Apache, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "I do not belong to you. I never did. I am his." The words cracked like thunder. The men shifted uneasily, some looking away, others gripping their weapons tighter. The Apache did not move, but his eyes flicked toward her with something fierce, something unspoken that made her chest burn. The rifle lifted, the barrel aimed straight at the Apache's chest. Time slowed. She could hear the rasp of her own breath, the pounding of her heart. The Apache's hand went to his bow, fluid and certain, but she knew even his skill could not outrun a bullet. Then the shot rang out. Dust exploded from the rock at his side. The girl cried out, but he did not flinch. He had already loosed his arrow. It cut the air like lightning and struck true. The young man staggered, the rifle tumbling from his hands. Chaos erupted. The other men lunged forward, knives flashing, voices shouting. The Apache moved with the fury of a storm bough snapping, knife flashing, every strike precise. He fought not for glory, not for vengeance, but for her. She stumbled back against the canyon wall, terror clawing at her, until one of the men broke free and charged at her with a blade. Instinct roared through her. She grabbed a stone from the ground and swung with all her strength. The man fell, cursing, blood running from his temple. Her hands shook, but she stood, alive, unbroken dot by the time the dust settled. The men who could still walk were retreating, dragging the wounded with them. Their shouts faded into the distance, swallowed by the canyon. Only silence remained. Silence, and the Apache standing over them, chest heaving, knife dripping. The girl rushed to him, her hands searching for wounds. There was blood, but not his own. His eyes met hers, steady despite the storm they had survived. "They will come again," she whispered, breathless. "Yes," he said simply. She swallowed hard, her fear clawing at her throat. "Then what do we do?" He looked out at the horizon, where the sky bled into night. His hand found hers, rough and scarred, but firm. For the first time, he held it not in passing, not an accident, but as a claim, as a promise. "We keep moving," he said. "We live." Tears burned her eyes, but she nodded. They were no longer bound by village or tradition, no longer safe in the arms of family or community. They were outlaws now, exiles, lovers bound not by law but by choice. As the stars lit the desert sky, they mounted the ridge together, silhouettes against the fire of dusk. Behind them lay judgment, whispers, and blood. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and endless horizon. But as they walked hand in hand into the vast unknown, one truth burned brighter than the stars overhead. A bull had been the price. Love was the reckoning.